We're sitting in one of these cottonwood forests on the banks of the Yellowstone River, and I've often been asked to tell the story of Colter's Run. But if anyone knows me, I can't just tell a story. I have to tell all the events that are taking place around the story. I have to give some background to this. John Colter was a member of the Lewis and Clark expedition, and he, along with George Drouillard, who was a half-breed and was the hunter of the Lewis and Clark expedition. He was a civilian member of the expedition, had been hired to be an interpreter and a hunter. And the Fields brothers, they were the four men who were often chosen by Lewis and Clark to do some of the most challenging tasks. The journey of Lewis and Clark, of course, is one of the great American adventure stories and one of the great events of American history. They traveled landscapes where no one had any idea what they would encounter in the way of peoples and wildlife and plant communities. They didn't know the landscape at all. They had no concept of the Rocky Mountains, and certainly not the magnitude of the Rocky Mountains. They knew there would be high ground separating the Missouri from the Columbia. Traveled over 4,000 miles in one direction. Wintered 1804-05 with the Mandan Indians, right about roughly where Bismarck, North Dakota is today, on the banks of the Missouri River, where there was a village of about 3,000 people, by the way, and a short ways downstream another village of 3,000 people. In addition, an abandoned village, which Meriwether Lewis noted in his journals may have been fortified. And it's possible that that village had been abandoned because of smallpox. The Fields brothers, John Colter, George Drouillard, they really were some of the truly excellent hunters, explorers, negotiators with Indians, and again, the whole expedition, all the members of the expedition, of which there were 33 people that went all the way to the West Coast, including York, William Clark's slave, including Sacagawea, often referred to as Sacagawea, who was probably about 15 or 16 years old at the time and was bringing her infant son with her, Jean-Baptiste, and her husband, who was probably the oldest member of the expedition, Toussaint Charbonneau. Charbonneau was a trader living at the Mandan and Minatari villages. The Minatari were a sub-tribe of what are often referred to as the Sioux or the Hidatsa, a little more accurate term there. And the Hidatsa were a true nomadic tribe. The Mandans were a sedentary tribe. They practiced agriculture. They grew corn and squash. They lived on the banks of the Missouri River. They lived in earthen lodges, whereas the Siouan cultures were more nomadic. In any case, but I'm just trying to give you some of the background of what's going on. Lewis and Clark come up, they're heading for the West Coast. They winter 1804-05 at the Mandan Indian villages, set up their camp on the opposite side of the Missouri River from the Mandans. They wanted to have a little bit of self-protection, built a fort, name it Fort Mandan. They're visiting with everyone. They're saying, anyone who knows anything about what's upstream, come and visit with us. We would like to know what's up there. And they're giving gifts in many cases, and they're probably giving gifts for information as well. Charbonneau shows up. He brings with him his two young Shoshone wives, one of whom is Sacagawea, and she's pregnant at that time, probably 15 or 16 years old, as I say. She's Shoshone. His other Shoshone wife, the Shoshone, lived essentially where I'm sitting right now on the bank of the Yellowstone, all the way over to the Three Forks and then to the Continental Divide. They too were a nomadic people. The Shoshone at the time, just prior to Lewis and Clark, and at the time that Lewis and Clark came to this area, were being heavily attacked by other tribes that were attempting to gain war honors, that would steal women and children, that would steal horses. They did not have the access to the guns that a number of the other tribes that were living on the Missouri River did have access to sooner, and so they were destitute at the time. Sacagawea and her family were camped at the Three Forks of the Missouri River, where the Gallatin, Madison, and Jefferson rivers come together, those three rivers named by Lewis and Clark when they finally got there, and when she was attacked and taken captive and taken all the way over about 300 miles further to the east to the Missouri, where she eventually becomes the wife of Toussaint Charbonneau. All along the banks of the river, the Missouri, the Yellowstone, these cottonwood forests were great places for the natives to camp set their villages in the winter time. Fuel from the trees, grazing for the horses on the floodplains associated with the river, and certainly the grasslands away from the river. Game, white-tailed deer on the lowlands, mule deer on the uplands, and of course, tens of millions of bison. And again, these floodplains had deeper soil, so the Mandans were agriculturists. And the Mandans, since they were sedentary, were essentially a middleman for trade with the whites. Nomadic tribes would come to the Mandans. The Mandans would provide housing and comfort and cultural experience and certainly joy, gambling, horse races, trade for the whites. So they essentially were sedentary, and other tribes would come to them. And of course, when Lewis and Clark arrived there, they're welcome. Now it happened at the Mandan villages. There were already French trappers and traders living there. Toussaint Charbonneau is one example. British traders from the Hudson's Bay Company, some of whom were actually French representatives of Hudson's Bay, were coming south and living and visiting with the Mandan as well. And of course, again, other tribes would come to that area at times. Now, not many whites had traveled further upstream. Very few. First documentation of a white man seeing the junction of the Yellowstone, or even talking about the Yellowstone, would have been in the late 1700s. So not many had gone past the mouth of the Yellowstone. And Lewis and Clark, visiting with these guys, say, what are we going to see when we go upstream? And they're told, you'll see a river coming in from the south, and the French trappers refer to it as the Roche Jaune. From the Mandan villages, they send the keel boat downstream. The river's getting more and more shallow, the gradient getting more and more steep as they continue upstream. And they send the keel boat back, create 6 dugout canoes, and along with the 2 pirogues, which were large dory-like boats, and 6 dugout canoes, they continue upstream, approaching the Rocky Mountains. So as they're coming upstream, they see the Yellowstone River coming in from the south. We don't know this from the journals, but it's entirely possible that Sacagawea or some of the other natives at the Mandan villages told them that the shortest distance to the headwaters of this river that you white men call the Missouri is to follow the Yellowstone as opposed to following the Missouri. And of course, Lewis and Clark knew that there would be these waterfalls, 5 waterfalls. Today, it's right near Great Falls, Montana. That would be a very difficult passage around those waterfalls. So they expected to see some big waterfalls, but it's a longer distance to follow the Missouri. Now, they are traveling by dugout canoe, they are traveling with the pirogues, and so they're traveling by a water route, and they assumed a water route would be the most efficient. So even if it's a longer distance, following the river may have been essential to find the most direct path to the Pacific Ocean. In addition, Thomas Jefferson had mentioned to them, had essentially directed them to follow the Missouri River to its source. So by sticking to the Missouri River, it was definitely more possible, and they didn't really know what they would encounter, and so they stuck with the Missouri River on their way west. Had Lewis and Clark and the members of the expedition not had the assistance of Native Americans, they would have never survived. Much of the oral history from the native tribes that they encountered described them as being desperate, dirty, starving, their clothes rotting off their bodies, and then the natives helped them, and of course they were able to survive and achieve their mission of making it all the way to the West Coast. So they really truly did need the help of the Native Americans. So at this point, as they come to the Three Forks, they're desperate for horses. The river gradient is getting more and more steep. They're having a very difficult time dragging their dugout canoes upstream, and they can only expect the gradient to get more steep as they get closer and further into the Rocky Mountains. Clark was ahead of Meriwether Lewis at this point in time when they encountered the Three Forks. He immediately went up the Jefferson Fork looking for Shoshone. He crosses over to the Madison River and then comes down the Madison River. It was July 1805. He comes down the Madison, he gets to the Three Forks. In the meantime, Lewis, who was with the water party at that time, comes up the Missouri, gets to the Three Forks, sees a note from William Clark, realizes Clark is further upstream, and Lewis climbs a high limestone bluff which overlooks the Three Rivers valleys. Today we call that point Lewis Rock. Meriwether Lewis describes himself in the journals as climbing that rock and drawing a map of the configuration of the rivers and how they converge to create the Missouri and the entire valley. Today, we have no idea where that map is. That map may be non-existent, but you never know when things can show up. Maybe it's still secreted away somewhere and no one knows where it is. But we know from his journals that Meriwether Lewis drew a map of the entire valley, though that map at present is not existent. Today, we call that point Lewis Rock. Lewis describes below himself the juncture of the Gallatin and the Madison, and how there's a high limestone bluff, which would be a suitable site for a fortification. Today we call that limestone bluff Fort Rock. From Lewis Rock, from Fort Rock is part of Headwaters State Park, but from these two high points, it's very easy to see how the rivers converge and where the Missouri is created by the junction of the Madison, Gallatin, and Jefferson. It's very easy to look out over the valley and try to imagine the elk, the deer, the beaver, the abundance of cottonwoods, the occasional black bear, grizzly bear, puma or mountain lion, the wild geese. All of these described in the journals as being present in this local area. Just a lush, truly productive landscape. As William Clark enters this valley, roughly from where I'm standing now, he sees a plain which had recently been burned. And it may have been ignited by natives who were warning, by Shoshone presumably, who are warning their own people about the approaching of this unknown group of white men who are certainly every once in a while banging guns. And so they may have been afraid. At the time that Lewis and Clark encounter the Shoshone, they're destitute. They've been attacked numerous times by the Minotari, a Siouan tribe, or Hidatsa, Lakota, tribes of areas further east on the Great Plains. And the Shoshone were basically hiding out. They were suffering, they were essentially starving. But Lewis and Clark are hoping to encounter them and hoping to trade for horses to help them cross the mountains. They don't have a good idea, the members of the expedition, how extensive the mountains are. They don't know how difficult it's going to be. They've heard that there will be a lack of game for purposes of food. They know it's already July. They know it's getting late in the year. They're afraid that they may not be able to cross the mountains by the time the winter comes on. And indeed, they nearly die when they're crossing the Rockies, in particular the Bitterroots, what are today called the Bitterroot Mountains. But as it is right here, they're searching for Shoshone. They don't encounter them for days. Clark does mention that it appears that the fire had been set fairly recently. More often than not, Clark stayed with the boats. And more often than not, Lewis would have been with a land party. There was generally a land party and a water party. Water party would get the gear and the boats upstream. Land party would do the hunting for food. Land party would view the landscape from high points. Land party would collect plant specimens and animal specimens, which by all means was a task and an interest of Meriwether Lewis's. And certainly Lewis had been directed to do this by then President Thomas Jefferson, as Lewis referred to him, the author of our enterprise. So, Sacagawea was taken captive at the Three Forks. When they arrive, she tells them that she had been taken captive 5 years prior, and they camp where her village was camped at that time, at the junction of the Madison and Jefferson Rivers. And now they really do have to cross the Rockies. And it was definitely one of the most arduous portions of the entire expedition route. Now it's getting late in the fall season. They're concerned about snow. It eventually does snow. They cross the Continental Divide. They cross the Continental Divide again. They cross it again. Without going into great detail, they nearly died as they were crossing the Rockies, and then continued down the drainage of the Columbia to the west coast. They winter at what they refer to as Fort Clatsop, just like similar to Fort Mandan, they named it after the local tribe. And so at Fort Clatsop, they wintered there, the winter 05-06, 1805 to 1806, and then they return. On the way back, William Clark and Meriwether Lewis split up. They had had all winter long to discuss what they were going to do on the way back. What additional information could they gather about the landscape, the natives, the wildlife, the weather, the soils, minerals, any potential for settlement? Thomas Jefferson had instructed them, was interested in all of this stuff. How best to gather information and what information would be valuable to encourage Americans to come out here. Jefferson knew unless Americans would come out here, it was entirely possible that the United States would not be able to hold on to the Louisiana Purchase. But on the way back east, on the return route, William Clark wanted to explore the Yellowstone. They had already seen the Missouri as well, so he wants to map the landscape. Lewis goes further north to experience the northernmost tributaries of the Missouri. On that event, they encounter 6 young Blackfeet. Some people would call them warriors. Some people would call them braves. Some people might call them boys. In that event, when they encounter them, they camp together, and unfortunately, 2 Blackfeet are killed. One on location. The other is wounded by a shot from Meriwether Lewis. He grabs his abdomen. He certainly would have died from that wound later on. If you talk to the Blackfeet today, they affirm this, and they generally refer to them as boys. Now, they were stealing the expedition's horses, the members of the expedition who were with Meriwether Lewis at the time, and Reuben Field stabs one of them, and that kills one of them. Lewis shoots the other one, and Lewis did leave. It'll sound like an oxymoron, but Lewis left a Jefferson Peace Medal, a token of peace made out of metal. He left it on the chest of one of them. I paraphrase, but so that they would know not to trifle with the Americans. That may have turned the Blackfeet against the Americans. Some people say the British turned the Blackfeet against the Americans. Killing 2 of them didn't help. Regardless, Clark goes down the Yellowstone. He gets to the junction of the Yellowstone and the Missouri River. He waits for Lewis to come down. Lewis comes downstream. Lewis had been severely wounded in a hunting accident in which Pierre Cruzat, who was heavily nearsighted, had been hunting elk, saw the color of an elk's body, which was almost certainly an elk's skin. It just happened to be on the body of Meriwether Lewis. And Lewis was severely wounded. The ball from Cruzat's musket went through one cheek of his rear end and out the other side. Clark, very nicely, these guys were good friends, cleaned the wound, patched it up, bandaged it, and for most of that period of time, for the remaining days to the Mandan villages, Lewis simply laid in the bottom of the canoe. Couldn't walk very well. They get together. They're on their way down to the Mandan villages. A short distance above the Mandan villages, they encounter 2 men coming upstream in canoes, Dixon and Hancock. They encounter these guys coming upstream in their canoes. And they start to visit. They all speak the same language. They start to visit, and Dixon and Hancock say, where'd you guys go? You know, they didn't know much about what Lewis and Clark had done. And when we went all the way to the Pacific Ocean, holy mackerel, Andy. Sorry, I use a contemporary line from an old TV show. And they realize that these guys know more about where they're going than they themselves know. So they return downstream to the Mandan villages with the members of the Corps of Discovery, with Lewis and Clark and the members of the expedition. And they all start to visit. Of course, Lewis and Clark were really, truly happy to get back to the Mandan villages. They got along great with the Mandans, and they did indeed want to take Native American representatives back with them to St. Louis and ultimately to Washington, D.C., which they did do, but that's another story. Regardless, they're visiting with the Mandans, they're visiting with their old friends, everybody is having a good time, and it's at that time that Dixon and Hancock invite John Colter to come back upstream with them to try to gain his fortune in the fur trade. The beaver was indeed incredibly valuable. So these guys are going downstream, they encounter Dixon and Hancock, return to the Mandan villages, and Dixon and Hancock invite John Colter to join them in their upstream journey. Certainly, Colter would have needed some traps, The members of the expedition probably carried some traps, but they probably didn't carry many. Dixon and Hancock may have staked Colter some traps. And Colter is talking about places where he has been, that he has seen. He can make recommendations as to where to camp, as to where the trapping may be best. So John Colter did what he wanted to do. He goes to Captains Lewis and Clark and he says, "Captains, I'm wondering if I can get a discharge. He's a soldier in the military. Can I be discharged so I can join these guys going upstream to attempt to gain my fortune in the beaver trade?" This puts Lewis and Clark in a bit of a quandary. If they let Colter go, the other guys might want to go. But if they let Colter go and he survives, there's great chance that he will learn more about the landscape, more about the native cultures and presence, more about the soils and the climate. He's been with Lewis and Clark this entire time. He's done his job really well. They certainly feel that perhaps he deserves some compensation for that, some reward for that. They would like to let him do it. He may learn more. But if they let him go, other members of the expedition may also want to leave. And they've still got lots of ground to cover in a downstream direction. And Lewis and Clark did what they often did in situations like this, where there might have been some contested situations. They basically brought everyone together and they said, "All you guys, John Colter has asked to stay, and we would like to let him stay." And presumably they tell them why. But if we're going to let Colter stay, for Colter to stay, we have to have everyone's assurance that all of you will continue with us all the way to St. Louis. And to a man. They'll say, "Captains, we're with you." This was a group of young men who knew they were making history, who knew they were a team, who were having the adventures of their lives. They had survived this far. Right now, they're on their way back and they're heading back as quick as they can. It's essentially been a successful expedition. Now's not the time to argue. But Lewis and Clark give John Colter his discharge. Lewis says, "Colter, when you come back to civilization, look me up and I'll have your wages and good luck." And that's when John Colter turns around, forsakes going back to so-called civilization, forsakes going back to St. Louis, and turns around and comes back upstream with Dixon and Hancock. Clark is in St. Louis, the year 1807, the spring of '07. An expedition is coming upstream. Heading this expedition is Manuel Lisa, who at the time controlled a lot of the fur trade in St. Louis. With Lisa, George Drouillard, the former hunter of the Lewis and Clark expedition. With Lisa, John Potts. And William Clark himself has invested cash in this expedition to capitalize on the fur trade. They're coming upstream. They're a ways downstream from the Mandan villages. And lo and behold, they see one lone white man, spring of 1807, coming downstream in a canoe. And it's John Colter. Now, we do have some idea of what happened to Dixon and Hancock, but a lot of it is conjecture. Dixon and Hancock, some people say they had a falling out. Some people say they had a falling out with John Colter. But regardless, Dixon and Hancock, they're in the past, and they did not journalize. Colter is coming downstream. He encounters the Lisa expedition. He encounters his old friends from the expedition. It's not even a year later. And they all visit. "Colter, how'd you winter?" "Well, I made it." "How about you guys?" "I kept my top knot. I kept my hair on." In other words, he wasn't killed by the Blackfeet. "And what about you guys?" "Well, we're going up to capitalize on the fur trade." And certainly Drouillard, Weiser, and Potts would have vouched for the integrity of John Colter. And even Colter himself would have talked about what he had encountered. Lisa stakes him. Lisa invites him to come with him. He's going to need gunpowder. He's going to need new lead for what his gun shoots. He's going to need a stack of traps. And so he turns around once again. And he would have been quite a distance, almost to St. Louis when he did this. It would not have been a big deal to keep going downstream to St. Louis. Once again, he turns around. Considering he'd only been out there for the winter and he's by himself, he could not have been carrying any significant amount of beaver, though I'm sure he had some. They come back upstream. They go up the Yellowstone River. Would that have been at the suggestion of John Colter? There's a good chance. Would that have been because Colter is saying, and some of the members of the expedition know this, of this Lisa expedition know this now, shorter distance to the Three Forks. They go up the Yellowstone River, and at the junction of the Bighorn and the Yellowstone River, they establish Fort Ramon. Now you see this published in many different ways. Fort Raymond, Fort Ramon, Fort Lisa, Fort Emmanuel, Fort Manuel. We see all these different terms used to describe this fort at the junction of the Bighorn and Yellowstone. But we know from Lisa's own journals that he named it after his firstborn son, Ramon. I tend to call it Fort Ramon, but you may hear me use other terms as I continue to tell you some of these events that took place. It's the spring of 1807. They establish a fur trading post at the junction of the Bighorn River and the Yellowstone River, which, by the way, this would have been the first structure constructed in what is now the state of Montana by Euro-American invaders, if you will, because this is Native American country. They were in the landscape of the Crow, who they got along with, and they were in the land, though they hadn't spent much time with them at that point in time, and they were in the landscape of numerous other Native American tribes. Regardless, they established that fur trading post. It's the spring of '07. In the fall of 1807, Manuel Lisa says to George Drouillard, Drouillard, you head south and east. Colter, you head south and west. Make contact with all the Crow Nation. Make contact with all the Indian tribes you encounter. Let them know about our fur trading post here. Tell them to bring their furs here. I'm going back to St. Louis. I'm going to go get the more blue beads, red beads, blue cloth, red cloth, more tobacco, some alcohol, some more traps, more lead, more powder. I'm going to get thimbles so that it's easier for the natives to sew. I'm going to get awls for punching holes in leather. I'm going to get bells. I'm going to get these trade goods that we know these people want. Metal cooking kettles. You know, they would take metal whiskey barrel hoops and flatten them out. And it was an easy way to transport metal that the natives could then heat up and cut into pieces and use for spear points, arrowheads, knife blades, tomahawks. So they basically were going back for trade goods. And by the way, when I mentioned blue beads, red beads, these were not common items in knives, tomahawk, metal tools. These were a big deal for the natives. And they wanted these things. Again, when it came to the fur trade, to ally themselves with the whites could be a good thing because they wanted, and as far as they were concerned, needed these trade goods. Keeping in mind, by the way, to some extent, when they buy into the white man's economy, they buy into dependence to some extent on that economy. And whiskey is always going to be part of that. And so this is a poison for many of the natives. Some of the natives, when Lewis and Clark offer a dram on their way upstream, they didn't give them a lot. They knew it could be a hazardous thing to do, but when they offered, some of the natives thought, why are you giving us this? Should we trust you? Because we know when we drink this stuff, it makes us foolish. We've seen it happen to our brethren. So there's no doubt about it. There's difficult cultural things going on here. There's difficult issues associated with that. But regardless, they do want those tools. So Lisa heads out in the fall of '07. He's going back to St. Louis. Drouillard heads south and east. Colter heads south and west. And it's at that time that John Colter made his foray through some part of what is now Yellowstone National Park. In the wintertime, '07, '08, departing by himself, probably carrying a buffalo robe and samples of trade goods, his buffalo robe being his shelter, and of course, a tomahawk or hatchet, a knife, and his gun. And his job was to make contact with mostly the Crow, because that was the landscape of the Crow, the Absoluca. Make contact with the Crow, tell him about the fur trading post at the junction of the Bighorn and the Yellowstone. I have to agree, it's with many people who are familiar with the story, is a monumental physical feat, but at the same time, quite the adventure. And he went on so many of these little forays and jaunts through the western landscape that I'm sure he just loved it. He had an aptitude for it. He had the skills necessary. He had the ability to endure the hardships required of travel in this rugged, mountainous landscape. Places like this, we're on the edge of a canyon. We happen to be close to some pretty rugged terrain. Finding his way. Where's the best place to cross the Yellowstone River? Where's the best place to cross the multitude of rivers that he must have encountered? It would have been spectacular. In addition, I do think that he had a lot of clues and probably assistance. He probably followed animal trails. I happen to be standing on what's a trail for bighorn sheep. He could have been following bison roads, as they were often referred to. And certainly he could have had natives tell him about these preferred routes, the most efficient routes on the landscape, because his mission was to interact with the Native Americans. His mission was to encourage them to trade with the white men. A lot of people are, they're just astonished that Colter did this, that he did this foray by himself, and people often talk about him doing it by himself. But keep in mind, his mission was to make contact with various settlements of natives. And so when the weather got really bad, I'm sure he just simply stayed with them, just simply stayed, in a village. And of course, in general, they wanted to ally themselves with the whites for purposes of trade, the natives did. And Colter obviously was something of a diplomat. He could communicate well with the natives. By now he's been living out here for a long time. He knows the plain sign talk, where you use your hands if you don't understand the language. By all means, they would have visited with Crow at the fort at some point in time. And I also think it's highly likely that at some point in time, Colter might have said, hey, I visited with you guys, now tell me where the next village is. And it wouldn't have been unusual for someone, a warrior, a brave, a young man, to say, well, I'll show you, I'll take you there. Maybe I'll give you a horse, and when you get back home, or when we depart, when we part ways, maybe you give me a gift, which would have been a logical thing to do. So in any case, I'm not so sure that Colter was suffering his way through the Yellowstone Plateau at that time. Historians do debate where he actually traveled on that journey in the winter of 07-08. But for the most part, I'm not too concerned myself about the minor details. We do know that when Colter eventually did go back to St. Louis and visited with his old captain, William Clark, we do know that William Clark added information to his map. We call it Clark's map of 1810. So in 1810, Colter goes back east, he visits with Captain Clark, and tells him where he has been. And the information on that map is incredible. It literally shows the Grand Canyon of the Yellowstone River, what's likely Yellowstone Lake. Ordinal direction and relative distance is incredibly accurate on the William Clark map of 1810. And it's astonishing that John Colter, who there's a very good chance couldn't read and write, told this information to William Clark several years, at least 2.5 years or so after he had seen it, told this information to William Clark and remembered relative distance, ordinal direction, and communicated it very accurately to William Clark. So John Colter did go through Yellowstone. At the same time, I'm sure there were times where he's by himself, and the winter is a very harsh season. But again, it'd be foolish to not encamp with some natives, with some friends, when the weather was at its most dire. By all means, if you stay with a tribe, if you stay with a village, if you're friendly with them, this can be an asset in the future for purposes of trade, that's the point, but also just for your peace of mind. Food and shelter and company and sociability and hanging around with people. Humans are social animals. So to live with the natives would have been a great, great thing. At the same time that I kind of make it sound like Colter wouldn't have done anything foolish, and perhaps it was a little easier because he was living with the natives and was attracted to them, I also don't want to minimize what this guy accomplished. traveling through the Yellowstone Plateau region. Colter was very close to the Continental Divide and may have even crossed it. Traveling through that region would be brutal winters. 4 or 5 feet of snow, temperatures well below zero were certainly possible and probable. In addition, imagine being one lone white man and you're walking up to an Indian encampment. And perhaps some half-wolf dogs come running out to greet you, and they're not necessarily friendly. You're a stranger. So this would be a difficult situation for me to imagine to negotiate. The typical thing to do is, as you approach the village and the dogs set up the alarm, would be to discharge your gun. My gun is empty. I come in peace. Maybe hold your hands up in a sign of welcome. And that could be a difficult situation when these dogs are coming, and then a whole bunch of people who don't know if you're a friend or an enemy in spite of your gestures, though they know they outnumber you, come galloping up on horses or running out and yelling, and they're carrying their weapons. And then, of course, you visit. Perhaps you lift your pipe, which often was carried around a man's neck on a thong. Lift your pipe and show them that you want to sit and counsel and smoke, which you always do when you visit. Sit and smoke in peace. Regardless, Colter did travel through some part of what is now Yellowstone National Park, and we do see evidence of this on William Clark's map, and I take it for what it's worth. I take it as it's stated, and it really is an incredible journey. There is a spot on Clark's map where it shows boiling spring. So we know Colter saw some thermal features, but based on the track that he outlined for Clark, very likely he saw multiple hot springs, and very likely he saw Yellowstone Lake and the Grand Canyon of the Yellowstone River. And then, in the spring of 1808, he comes back to Fort Ramon at the junction of the Bighorn and the Yellowstone River. And Druryard returns, Lisa returns, Potts returns, and they all continue to trap the beaver. They all continue to capitalize on the beaver fur. John Colter, often referred to as the original mountain man. That foray he made through Yellowstone, that these subsequent expeditions he made numerous times after the expedition of Lewis and Clark, not going back to St. Louis, not going back to the so-called civilized world for 4 more years after the expedition concluded, but staying out here, trying to capitalize on the beaver, trying to capitalize on the beaver gold. And again, ultimately, to finally go back to civilization, to escape the trials and tribulations of the Rocky Mountains, to go back and die in the so-called civilized world. But he lived a world of adventure and attained fame in his own time. He becomes just about, and possibly more than I'm willing to admit, an American myth, an American hero, the winner, with a tragic ending. Colter and Potts, 1808, come to the Three Forks on their own. So after the expedition, 2 years after the expedition essentially concludes, Colter and Potts are back into this region to trap the beaver. Further to the east, on the Yellowstone River, Manuel Lisa has established Fort Ramon, named after his firstborn son, at the junction of the Bighorn and the Yellowstone. Lisa establishes that fur trading post. They trap through the year 1807-08. Colter made his foray through some part of what is now Yellowstone. He comes back to the fort, and eventually in 1808, Potts and Colter on their own come up the Yellowstone River, over the pass, dividing high ground between the Yellowstone and the Upper Gallatin River, and eventually drop down the Gallatin to the Three Forks and go up the Jefferson, the intent to trap beaver. Some of what I'm going to tell you is conjecture. Some of it is fact. And so I think you'll be able to tell the difference between the two. But it is a great story of American Western history and the American fur trade. Colter and Potts. They're up the Jefferson River. They've just pulled their traps. They've got the traps in the canoe or canoes. They've got whatever beaver they've just caught with them in the boats. When all of a sudden, they hear a bunch of hoofbeats up on the bank. Just a without saying a word. Each guy knows what the other guy's thinking. They look at each other. Is it a herd of buffalo? Or is it Blackfeet horses? Immediately, first thing they do, they drop the traps over the side of the canoes into the water. If it's Blackfeet, and the Blackfeet get the upper hand, they're going to want the steel that those traps are made from. They're going to want those traps. Next thing they do, they ditch whatever beaver they have. If they got beaver, then the Indians know the Blackfeet know they have traps. So they ditch whatever beaver they have. Again, if it's not, we come back for all this stuff later on. Colter and Potts are in the slough. Now there's many versions of the story of Colter's run. There's many versions of this interaction. It's one of the great adventure stories of the American West. You can hear somebody tell it to you on a horseback ride or when you're out with a fishing guide, and certainly there's been some incidents, portions of it that have been put into movies and short stories. So there's many versions of the story of Colter's run. What I want you to know is that the version you're going to hear today is the true one. Now, quite often people, they snicker a little bit when I say that. But the fact of the matter is, like I said, you can Google this, you can do research on this, you can find the documented accounts of what was told by John Colter in relation to his incident with the Blackfeet on the Jefferson River. At the same time, some of what I think of relates to how I am aware of those people making a living, how they lived. Colter and Potts are up that slough. They've ditched their traps, they've ditched the beaver. Some people say that Potts said, Colter, we got nothing to worry about, it's just a herd of elk, herd of buffalo. Let's keep on trapping. Other people say that Colter said, no, Potts, I think we should hang right here. I just got a bad feeling about this. Again, I wasn't there. I don't know exactly what took place, but I do know these two guys are good buddies. They have been out here together for multiple years. And these are two guys who trust each other. I find it very difficult to imagine them arguing about whether they should hide out or continue to trap. But we do know they ditched their traps, they ditched the beaver, and then they paddled out onto the main river. And I think it's entirely possible that they paddled out on the main river because the current is swifter. When we're in a backwater slough, the river's not moving very fast. There's essentially no current. But when we're on the river, the water moves faster. So if it's Blackfeet, and if they can get away without being seen, get out on the main river and paddle downstream as fast as you can and come back later for the traps. I just think that's a possibility. We do know from Colter's own version of this story that they went out on the main river and immediately 300 Blackfeet warriors right up on the bank of the river. They immediately see the white men. Half the group splits off, runs down the bank of the river, gets to a shallow spot, runs, splashes across to the other side. Now they got natives on both sides of the river, and they're gesturing to the white men. Now, Colter and Potts, they don't speak Blackfeet, and the Blackfeet presumably didn't speak English, but they gesture, white men, white men. White man was to act as if you're pushing your sleeve up the untanned underside of your arm. White men, come in, let's sit, let's counsel. Counsel is to act as if you're rolling a ball of tobacco. And because every time you counsel, every time you visit, you sit and smoke, you share the tobacco. Now Colter and Potts certainly would have gestured back. The white man is your friend, but we have to go downstream. I don't know what the Blackfeet would have said, but white man, come on in, let's sit, let's counsel. We're your friends, you can trust us, come on in. Again, I don't know, but Potts and Colter probably said, The white man is your friend, but we have to go downstream. Finally, a couple of braves, a couple of warriors, they get tired of this little game. They jump in the river, they swim out to the canoes, they drag the canoes towards the shoreline. Potts says, Colter, if I'm going, I'm taking somebody with me. He lifts his rifle from the bottom of the canoe. Colter says, no! Potts lifts his gun, shoots one of the Indians. Immediately, Potts is covered in arrows. As Colter said, he was made a riddle of. Colter has just seen his best buddy killed. They grab the canoes, drag him to the shore, pull Potts' body out of the canoe, take his gun, take his knife, strip the clothes from his body, start hacking him up into little pieces. They grab Colter, pull him out of his canoe, take his gun, take his knife, strip the clothes from his body, start throwing Potts' blood and guts right into his face. Colter has just seen his best friend killed and dismembered. He's drenched in his buddy's blood and guts. The whole time, he stands straight and shows no emotion. He knows if he shows any emotion, it'll be perceived as a sign of weakness. Shows absolutely no emotion. He's looking for a way out of this. Doesn't look good, but he's looking for a way out of this. It's possible he said something along the lines of, let's counsel, shows his pipe. I want to be your friend. I don't know. But supposedly the chief comes up to Colter. Ain't it always the chief? Chief comes up to Colter, gestures to him. White men, we killed your friend. We kill you. I don't know what Colter said. I know he's thinking for a way out of this. He may have said something along the lines of, my friend was strong. I am strong. All of you. It took all of you to kill my friend. Look how many arrows you used. It took all of you. All of you can kill me. But if you are strong, it'll be 1 against 1. Chief's a little taken aback by this. Think you're tough? Gestures to Colter. White man, can you run? Can you run fast? Again, I don't know what Colter said, but I suspect he said something. He's looking for a way out of this. He's trying to parlay his way out of this. It's possible he said something like, I run fast. The white men think I run fast, but I am not a fast runner. The white men think I run fast because they always ride horses. Their legs are round. Maybe your legs are round from riding the horse. Maybe you don't run fast. I am not a fast runner. But the white men think I'm a fast runner. The chief gestures, white men, start running. In the meantime, all the warriors, they're all making a line. Each man is stripping off every piece of clothing he doesn't need. Each one is grabbing his favorite weapon. Maybe it's a club with a rock tied on the end of it to clobber somebody with. Maybe it's a tomahawk. Maybe it's a knife. Maybe it's a spear, a lance. Each one stripping down the breechclouts and moccasins, forming a line and just staring at Colter. The chief starts to lead Colter away from the river. Colter's thinking, they're going to shoot me in the back. He turns around, he stands there. Chief gives him a shove. No, white man, run fast. And Colter realizes it's going to be a race for his life. He starts to run. As Colter said, I started running kind of slow. I thought if I looked like I was a slow runner, they'd maybe give me a bigger head start. He knows he's on the Jefferson River. He knows he's about 5 miles from the Madison River. Gotta make it. Can't stumble. Gotta make it. He starts running. He's about 100 yards out there. Indians just looking at him. 200 yards out there. Indians 300, 400 yards out. He's about 500 yards out there. The Indians let a big whoop. They start chasing after him. Colter starts putting on the speed. Gotta make it. Gotta pace myself. Can't stumble. Can't fall. They killed Potts. They're gonna kill me, sure. Gotta make it. Gotta make it. And Colter starts putting on the speed. He was a good runner. When members of the Lewis and Clark expedition were living with the Mandans, when they're living with the Nez Perce, this wasn't just hang out. There was a lot of cultural exchange, a lot of sharing, a lot of friendly competition, if you will. They would have, they teach each other their music and their songs. The white men would show them how to use a gun. The natives would show them how to use a bow and arrow. They would dance together. They really did interact a lot. But they would have wrestling contests. They would have foot races, and we know from the journals themselves, George Drouillard was a fast runner, and so was John Colter. So Colter knew he was a fast runner, and he starts putting on the speed. He's got to make it to the Madison River. Figures, if I can make it to the Madison, maybe I can hide out in the willows along the bank like I did that time when I was with the Flatheads and we were battling against the Blackfeet. Which I want you to keep in mind too. It's entirely possible that some of these Blackfeet warriors recognize Colter from that previous event. It's entirely possible. We don't know, but it's entirely possible. You don't forget. You remember forever. Regardless, Colter is running. He knows he's about 5 miles from the Madison. Gotta make it, can't stumble, can't fall, looks over his shoulder, sees a few guys gaining on him, and Colter just puts on the speed. Gotta do it, but I gotta pace myself, and Colter continues to run. But now, he's about a mile out there. He's not doing too bad. Sees a few guys gaining on him. He just pump it up. Just keep on going. But now he's on the high ground. He's going away from the riverbank. His lungs are starting to burn. His heart is starting to pound in his chest. But he's away from the river. And up on these dry hills in the distance, there's two things that the members of the expedition, the members of the Lewis and Clark expedition, complained about more than anything else. Two things they complained about more than anything else for the entire western portion of the expedition. One of them, almost like me today, mosquitoes. Mosquitoes very troublesome. A direct quote from William Clark. But the other one, prickly pear cactus. So up on the high ground, dividing the drainage of the Jefferson from the drainage of the Madison, up on the high ground around us here on the Yellowstone, prickly pear cactus. Colter has no moccasins, no shoes, no weapons, naked as a jaybird, drenched in his buddy's blood and guts. The natives have moccasins, they have weapons, they're coming strong, they're coming fast. Colter is running as hard as he can. His lungs are burning, his heart is just thumping in his chest, he can feel it pounding in his ears. But now, his feet are getting pincushioned by the prickly pear cactus, and every footfall, it burns, it hurts. The spines break off, they get embedded in the skin, his feet are starting to swell, his feet are starting to bleed. He's about 1.5 miles, 2 miles out there, he's not doing too bad, sees a few guys gaining on him, but Colter just pumps it on up. But now, heart is pounding and his lungs are burning, doesn't know if he can make it, ignore the pain, keep on running. They kill Potts, they're gonna kill me sure, gotta make it. Colter gets to the high ground, dividing the Jefferson from the Madison. He can see the green trees following the Madison River. Gotta make it down there, running, but now he's going downhill. But his feet are swelling, his feet are burning with pain, his heart is just pounding in his chest. He just doesn't know if he can do it anymore. He looks over his shoulder, sees one guy breaking from the pack of natives, and he's gaining on him, and he's gaining fast. One tall, lean guy carrying a spear, and he's just coming along, steady as can be, his eyes fixed on Colter. And I have to admit, I think for that individual who was chasing Colter, maybe he knew himself that he's a fast runner. You never know. You make it look more dramatic. I mean, you're chasing a white guy who has no weapons, no clothes. You scared the bedoodle out of him, and he's got no moccasins. And you're fresh and young and strong, which all the members of the Lewis and Clark expedition were young and strong, but all these warriors are young and strong as well. So they're all young men, really fit, willing to take on the challenge. And this guy is gaining on Colter, he's gaining fast. If he makes it look more dramatic to capture and kill Colter, he gains more honor, perhaps, in the eyes of his brethren. So, Spotted Horse, that was amazing how you caught that guy. How you caught up with him and you killed him, sure. I knew I could do it. The Plains tribes believed that power was transferable. So if you kill that white man and you take his tools, you have gained his power. Not only his tools, but the power that goes with those things. The eagle is flying overhead. It molts a feather. The feather falls to the ground. Everybody knows the eagle has great eyesight. I take that feather, I put it in my medicine bundle, I tie it in my hair, which would have been a great privilege to do that. You have to gain more honors to tie it in your hair. But I gain the eagle power. Maybe now my eyesight is better. Maybe now I am a better hunter because my eyesight is better. So to be able to be the one who killed Colter, you know, maybe you're the guy who gets his gun, who gets his knife, but you get his power. And so this would be a big deal. And if you make it look all the more difficult, like this long, tall, lean fellow with the spear is perhaps may hope for, you make it look more difficult, you kill him, then you gain more power. You made it look more challenging in the eyes of your buddies, and you did indeed take a greater chance to do that. So there's no doubt about it. There's a lot of little things going on here. But Colter is running as hard as he can. The rest of the natives are pretty far back there. Colter is running as hard as he can, and this guy is gaining on him. Colter thinks it's now or never. I gotta do this. He's like 2 miles, another mile to make it to the Madison River, and his lungs are burning, his heart is just pounding in his chest, his feet are swelling and bleeding. He tastes something wet in his mouth. He thinks it's sweat. It tastes very, very salty. He takes his hand, he runs across his face. His hand is covered in blood. He's running so hard he's busted blood vessels in his sinuses. Blood is streaming from both nostrils down his chest, mixing with the blood of his buddy Potts. And Colter is thinking, I'm a mess, but I gotta make it. And he just running as hard as he can, just swinging his legs. And he hears this guy gaining on him behind himself. And he realizes, I ain't gonna make it. And if I'm gonna die, I'm gonna die facing death like a man. And he keeps on running, but just when he figures any second I'm gonna feel that spear in my back, Colter spins around, drops to his knees, raises his arms over his head. The native is so shocked by this bloody white man who stopped right in front of him, so short. He raises the spear to attack Colter, but he stumbles, he falls, he hits the ground. His momentum carries him forward. The point hits the ground. He hits the ground so hard the shaft of the spear breaks off. The spear is stuck in the ground. The native rolls over. Colter runs forward, grabs the spear, drives it through the man's chest, pins him to the ground with the remaining parts of the spear. The rest of the natives see this happening. Colter runs as hard as he can. He's almost shocked himself that he managed to win this little fight, and he keeps on running. The Blackfeet said the beaver spirit saved him. Colter, the beaver spirit, was a giant beaver. Took him into his lodge. I wasn't there. I don't know. Maybe the beaver spirit did save him. The way Colter described it, he came up underneath a pile of sticks. The rest of the natives, they actually slowed down to pull the spear from the chest of their buddy. Colter said it gave me a little bit more head start. But now he's in the cold water of the Madison River, comes up underneath a pile of sticks, hears the Indians coming to the bank of the river, sees their shadows, and hears them walking across the pile of wood over his head. Maybe it was a big beaver lodge. Maybe it was a pile of flood debris. I don't know. But Colter's hiding underneath these logs, trying to hold his breath. But the fact of the matter is, he's also dying for oxygen. Thinks to himself, they know I'm in here. They're gonna light this thing on fire. I'm a dead man anyway. But they don't. And nighttime comes. Colter slips out of his hiding place, goes down the Madison, gets to the Gallatin, up the Gallatin, over Clark's Pass, down the Yellowstone, back to Fort Ramon. No beaver, no traps. His buddy's dead. No clothes, no weapons, no tools, no moccasins. You know, you hear many versions of this story. Many people say, oh, he took a blanket from the Indian. I can't imagine a guy running a foot race carrying a blanket. Many people say he took the spear point with him. Colter's own version, he left it in the man's chest. What many people don't realize is the abundance of resources right in this area. When William Clark came here on the way back to St. Louis, when he comes over Clark's Pass down the Yellowstone River, he says 3 days in a row, immense numbers of buffaloes, elks, and their constant companions, wolves. I can easily imagine Colter seeing a bunch of wolves on a dead bison, or even finding a bison, that's been dismembered and eaten, but the bones are still intact and fairly fresh. Smash that bone. Break it on a cobble rock on the bank of the river. Take the marrow from the bone, healthy fat. Take the hide from an old dead buffalo. Take the hide, soak it in the river. Take a rock from the bank of the river, break it. Use it to chisel that hide into strips. Tie it on your feet. Make a crude pair of moccasins. Take the hide, cut it in strips, tie together a few logs, maybe to make a crude raft. At the same time, the Blackfeet know where Fort Ramon is. You could bank on it. You could bank on the fact that they knew that the white men had a trading post down there at the junction of the Bighorn and the Yellowstone. Some people say, notably Fred Gowans, a history professor, I think it was Utah State University, said Colter didn't go through the pass. He knows the Blackfeet could be watching that trail. He climbs the Bridger Range of mountains and goes down the other side to avoid the most logical trail that he would follow. Or he travels only at night. A little over 200 miles in 11 days. No tools, no weapons, no moccasins. But he made it. He made it to the fort. He gets back there. Colter, what you doing? Well, guys, Bugs Boys got me. That was the term for the Blackfeet, Bugs Boys. Bugs was the devil. Now, I don't want you to think that I think anything bad of the Blackfeet. This was all a different time and a different place. But that was their slang term for the Blackfeet. Bugs Boys got pots. And they almost nearly got me. Colter recuperates. It's the fall, it's late in 1808. He recuperates for a while, and then one day he starts putting together all his possibles, packing up his war bag. The rest of the guys are like, Colter, where are you going? Who, me? Yeah, where are you going? I'm going to the Three Forks. Going to the Three Forks? My God, Colter, Potts got killed there. You nearly got killed there with the Flatheads. What the heck you going there for? Gonna get them traps. And he did. He came back up the Yellowstone River, over Clark's Pass, down the Gallatin, up the Jefferson, back to that slough. And now he's got 2 sets of traps. You can't do what you're out here to do unless you have the traps. This is what it's about. So Colter went and got the traps. Now you hear versions of that story. Some people say Colter was on his way back. He was camping out, sitting by his fire in the nighttime, when all of a sudden a musket ball hits the fire and scatters the ashes. It was the Blackfeet trying to kill him. You know, you hear these things. Colter would not have been having a fire at night. He would have cooked in the daytime if he was going to cook anything. They could just ambush him. They don't need to sneak up on him around a fire. They could ambush him. There's a lot more of them. Colter could have easily been wiped out had they really wanted to do it. Now it's 1808, and they go into the year 1809, and everybody commences to trap. And by the way, as Colter told the story, he said he made a promise with God when he was running that race, that if God would let him survive, he would never return to the Three Forks. Well, in the fall of 1809, Pierre Menard and Andrew Henry, 2 guys who are now involved in the Missouri River fur trade, along with Manuel Lisa, they come upstream. They got about 30 guys with them. They come up to Fort Ramon. Boys, we're looking for some volunteers. We're going to try one more time to make friends with the Blackfeet. And John Colter signs up. And George Drouillard signed up. The following year, Pierre Menard and Andrew Henry and members of the Fort Ramon trapping party, they returned to the Three Forks once again in an attempt to make friends with the Blackfeet and to trap the beaver. They established Fort Three Forks at the junction of the Madison and the Jefferson. One day, 6 guys are up the Jefferson River. 2 guys are in a base camp, 2 guys are trapping in the vicinity of the base camp, and 2 other guys are trapping upstream of the base camp. They're trapping in pairs, partly because they're afraid of encountering Blackfeet, partly because of the abundance of grizzly bears. When the two guys who are trapping in the vicinity of the base camp all of a sudden hear some shots and some shouts, and they realize, Blackfeet! They go running back to the base camp, and they run right into the rear end of a bunch of Blackfeet, fire a few shots, realize we are way outnumbered. They hustle down the Jefferson River back to the fort, to Fort Three Forks, grab some reinforcements, come back upstream, get to the base camp. All they find is a bloody spot in the grass, their two buddies all chopped up in little pieces. The other two guys further up to Jefferson, never heard from again, presumably killed by Blackfeet. Everybody goes back to the fort. My God, what happened? What are we going to do? They let things settle down for a few days. They leave little gifts out for the natives. Tie some blue ribbon and red ribbon in the shrubs outside the fort. Things disappear, little bags of tobacco. They're trying to make friends. They never even see the natives. The gifts disappear. Finally, let some time go by and they commence the trapping again. Again, some guys are attacked and killed. They get back to the fort. Again, they let it rest for a while. Leave some gifts out. They're hoping to make friends with the Blackfeet. Again, they start trapping, and again, some guys are attacked. It gets to the point where they're literally prisoners of their own design in their own fort. Finally, George Drouillard, the famous hunter of the Lewis and Clark expedition, he can't take it anymore. He says, boys, I'm going trapping. I'm getting out there. I'm going to get the beef. George, how are you going to do this? I'm half Indian. I can out-Indian any Indian. Remember, George was half Shawnee and half French. He'd grown up in the West. This is a very, very skilled outdoorsman. He was the hunter of the Lewis and Clark expedition. I'm going out at night. That night, he takes his traps. He takes off from the fort, takes his horse with him, goes up to Jefferson, sets his traps, comes back. And again, next night he goes out. Comes back, he's got 6 beaver. Beaver tail stew for dinner tonight, boys. These guys apparently they loved eating the beaver, particularly the tail, which I would suspect is fairly muscular but also coated in fat. These guys loved fat. They wanted high calories. They're wading in cold, cold streams and living their lives in the outdoors. George comes back. He's got the beef. Again, he had reset his traps. Next night, George takes off again. Again, he comes back. He's got some beaver. That's pretty cool, George. The other guys are starting to think about doing this. But the next night, George takes off, and he doesn't come back. The next day, when it gets light, they form a search party. 20 guys go up the Jefferson River, about 2 miles from the fort. They find George's horse, dead, covered in arrows. The horse's throat is slit. Presumably, George killed his horse, dropped it to the ground, used it as a bulwark against the oncoming Blackfeet. And behind the horse, George all chopped up in little pieces. And as Thomas James said, more than a little bit of sign that he took a few of the red devils with him. Now I want you to know, red devils, that's Thomas James' word, not mine. The Blackfeet were in their own landscape. It did happen that in many cases it seems that a number of tribes use this Three Forks area. It's a travel corridor today by roads and railroads and highways, and I suspect for many it was a travel corridor back then for the natives, for the various tribes, various trails. So George Drouillard, the famous hunter of the Lewis and Clark expedition, and John Potts, another former member of the Lewis and Clark expedition, killed by the Blackfeet in the vicinity of the Three Forks of the Missouri River. A lot happened at the Three Forks of the Missouri. Sacagawea was camped here when she was taken captive with her family, and a number of tribal members were killed. A number of children were taken captive by the Minotari. Lewis and Clark camped for 3 days at the headwaters of the Missouri River at the Three Forks. Clark comes back to the Three Forks on his way back towards St. Louis, and Fort Three Forks was established, and John Colter was nearly killed, John Potts was killed, and George Drouillard was killed in the vicinity of the Three Forks of the Missouri River. With the death of George Drouillard, the members of this expedition, they decide, my God, if George can't make it, how are we going to make it? And the season has progressed. The trapping season has progressed. They don't have enough food stored for the winter season. They don't have enough hides stored to make it a viable hunting expedition for the beaver. And they decide to abandon the fort. Half the group goes with Andrew Henry to the west, where they winter on what today is called the Henry's Fork of the Snake River, which would be like trying to winter in Yellowstone National Park. Cold temperatures, deep snow, they nearly died. The other half of the group, including John Colter, returned to St. Louis with Pierre Menard. Colter goes downstream, he gets to St. Louis. On the way, he tells the story of his escape from the Blackfeet and the death of John Potts, and two guys write it down along the way. One of the members of that actual expedition, Thomas James, who describes that Three Forks incident and the death of Juilliard, he actually met Colter and heard the story from Colter himself and wrote about it decades later. Colter gets back to St. Louis. He visits with William Clark. It's 1810. He hasn't been to the white man communities since 1804. And now he gets back there and he tells Clark what he has seen, describes his foray through some part of what is now Yellowstone National Park in the wintertime. And Clark takes that information and puts it on his map of 1810. We call it William Clark's map of 1810. A hand-drawn version in 1810 that Clark drew goes to London and is published in 1814. But even that map, most people refer to it as Clark's map of 1810. It's just a way of describing the information on that map. And the map is very interesting and incredibly detailed, and in many regards, extremely accurate. Colter gets back to St. Louis. He visits with William Clark. Clark gives him the bad news. Your old captain, our friend and former captain, Meriwether Lewis, is dead. Lewis had apparently committed suicide, a true tragedy for anyone, though at the same time, I consider Meriwether Lewis to have been a true American hero. The information gathered, his organization of the expedition, and even many of the tasks he achieved after the expedition took place are truly monumental and incredibly significant. Meriwether Lewis was on his way back to Washington, D.C. to explain to Thomas Jefferson why the maps and the journals had not yet been published. And he dies at Grinder's Stand on the Natchez Trace by his own hand. Many people believe he was murdered. I'm one of those people who believed that, unfortunately, tragically, he committed suicide. Regardless, Lewis achieved many great accomplishments in his life, and the journey of Lewis and Clark, the Corps of Discovery, all the way to the Pacific coast, was organized and planned by him. He was specifically chosen, remember, by Thomas Jefferson to be the leader of this expedition, and he invited William Clark to be his co-captain on this expedition. Within that 1 year, Colter gets his land grant. Each member of the expedition got a land grant upon conclusion of the expedition. He gets his land grant, becomes a farmer, gets married, his wife gets pregnant, and then he signs up to fight in the War of 1812, where he dies in 1813 of jaundice, which may have been acute hepatitis, which would result in a liver disease. Jaundice, turning your skin yellow, not well understood at the time. But the crazy thing is that he had to return to the so-called civilized world to die of a white man's disease, possibly getting hepatitis in the unsanitary living conditions of the forts.